It was a bitterly cold night, and the snowflakes danced around the lonely streets of the small town, covering everything in a blanket of white. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch forever. In the midst of the silence, a small, shivering cat moved cautiously through the snow. Her fur, once vibrant and orange, now hung in tangled clumps, matted from the harsh life she'd led on the streets. Her eyes were wide and filled with fear, darting from shadow to shadow as she searched for any sign of food, any sign of safety. Maggie, the little tabby, had been living on the streets for weeks now. She'd learned to trust no one, to rely only on herself for survival. But tonight, as she padded quietly along the sidewalk, a different kind of loneliness filled her heart. The hunger gnawed at her insides, and the cold bit through her fur, seeping into her bones. She had no place to go, no one to care for her. Her small body trembled with both fear and the chill in the air. The wind howled as Maggie moved closer to the edge of the alley, where a flickering street lamp cast its weak light. The faint scent of food lingered in the air, and her stomach growled loudly. She hesitated, her green eyes narrowing as she approached the garbage can that sat in the alley. She could smell the remnants of food, but it was mixed with the sour, unfamiliar scent of something else, a warning that made her pause. Maggie's instinct told her to be careful, but hunger was stronger. She cautiously padded toward the garbage can, sniffing it carefully. Her whiskers twitched in the cold air as she heard the distant sound of a car approaching, its headlights cutting through the snowy mist like a blade. Panic flared in Maggie's chest. Her claws instinctively dug into the icy ground, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. She darted behind a trash bin and flattened herself against the cold stone wall of the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. The car slowed and came to a stop just in front of her hiding spot. For a moment, everything went still. Maggie stayed hidden, her breath shallow and quick, her body tense. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, hoping that whatever was coming would just pass her by. Then the sound of a car door opening broke the silence. Soft, tentative footsteps crunched on the snow-covered sidewalk, growing closer. Maggie's ears perked up as she heard the voice of a woman, gentle, soothing, but with an underlying tone of concern. "It's okay, girl," the woman said softly. "We're not going to hurt you." Maggie's eyes narrowed as she peered around the corner. She saw the woman standing just a few feet away, holding a bag of food. The woman's face was soft and kind, illuminated by the dim light from the street lamp. Maggie's heart raced as she watched the woman slowly kneel down, setting the food carefully on the ground. Behind the woman stood a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with bright, eager eyes. She held her breath, watching the cat with wide eyes, her fingers gripping her jacket tightly. "Mom?" the girl whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Do you think she'll trust us?" The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with compassion. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said. "Let's give her some time." Maggie's eyes flicked from the woman's warm, outstretched hand to the food on the ground. She was hesitant, unsure whether to trust them. She'd seen many people come and go, all of them with their own agendas, but never anyone who had offered her kindness without expecting anything in return. Slowly, carefully, Maggie took a step forward. The woman didn't move. She simply smiled, her voice soft as she spoke again. "It's okay, girl. You don't have to be afraid." For a moment, Maggie stood frozen, torn between hunger and distrust. But something in the woman's voice, in the quiet warmth that radiated from her, broke through the wall Maggie had built around her heart. With a cautious step, Maggie moved closer, her eyes flicking nervously between the woman's face and the food. She stopped just shy of the plate, watching the woman's every move. And then, with a tentative paw, Maggie reached out and tapped the food. It was enough. The woman let out a soft laugh of relief, her face lighting up with joy. "You're brave," she whispered, her voice full of warmth. Maggie hesitated for another moment, but then she took a step forward and began to eat, the hunger finally outweighing her fear. It was a small moment, but it was the first step toward a life she had longed for. A life with love, warmth, and safety. Maggie didn't know it yet, but her journey was about to change forever. As Maggie finished the last bite of food, she felt a warmth in her belly that had been missing for so long. The cold wind continued to whip around her, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel so alone. She lifted her head and looked up at the woman and her daughter, her green eyes filled with cautious curiosity. They were still there, standing in the snow, watching her with gentle eyes. The woman smiled softly, as though she could sense Maggie's hesitation, but also her hunger for something more. Maggie took a small step back, but the woman's voice broke through her thoughts. "Would you like to come home with us?" she asked, her voice kind but firm. "We have a warm place, and you won't have to be alone anymore." Maggie's ears flicked nervously, her instincts warring with her desire for safety. She knew this could be another trick, another false promise. The streets had taught her that kindness was rare, that people couldn't be trusted. But something in the woman's tone, the way she held herself so steady, so sure of her words, made Maggie pause. It was like the woman wasn't asking her to trust her immediately. Instead, she was simply offering a choice. The little girl, Alice, took a step forward, her small face lighting up as she smiled at Maggie. "You can stay with us, okay? We'll take care of you." Her voice was filled with such pure sincerity that Maggie's heart fluttered, unsure of what to make of the feeling. She had never known such kindness, especially from a child so young. The wind howled around them, but for a moment, everything else fell away. Maggie's thoughts were clouded by her instincts, her heart aching with the memory of hunger and loneliness. But the warmth in the woman's voice and Alice's hopeful eyes seemed to reach into a place she hadn't allowed anyone to touch for a long time. Maggie took another hesitant step toward them. Her legs were stiff from the cold, and her body ached with hunger, but the warmth emanating from them felt like a promise. She looked down at the food, then back at the woman and Alice, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She was so used to being on her own, so used to running from anyone who tried to get too close. But something about the gentle way they stood there, waiting patiently, made her want to take a chance. Alice knelt down and held out her hand, her face full of expectation. "Come on, Maggie, we'll keep you safe," she said, her words quiet but full of hope. Maggie hesitated. The harsh winter air nipped at her fur, and her stomach growled in protest. But this time, it wasn't hunger that pushed her forward. It was the ache for something she didn't even know she missed. A family. A home. With a tentative step, Maggie walked closer to Alice. She sniffed her hand, her nose twitching as she took in the scent of something unfamiliar but comforting. The soft, welcoming touch of Alice's hand sent a shiver through Maggie's body, but it wasn't the cold this time. It was the warmth of something new, something unexpected. The woman, Deborah, smiled as Maggie inched closer, her face soft with understanding. She reached out slowly, offering her own hand. Maggie hesitated, but then, something in her shifted. She gently nuzzled Deborah's hand, feeling the warmth of the woman's palm, the gentleness of her touch. It was an unspoken promise that spoke louder than words. "You're not alone anymore." Deborah's voice was low and comforting. "It's okay, Maggie. You're safe now." In that moment, Maggie knew that things were different. She wasn't just taking a step toward a warm place to sleep. She was taking a step toward something far greater, belonging. The days of being alone in the cold, scrounging for scraps, were over. Here, in this small family's home, Maggie would finally find something she'd been searching for her whole life. Love. Deborah stood up, motioning for Alice to follow. "Let's go home, Maggie. You're part of the family now." With one last look at the dark, cold alley she had once called her world, Maggie turned around. Her little legs were stiff from the cold, but each step she took toward the warmth of the house felt like a victory. The snowflakes continued to fall around them, but they no longer felt like barriers. They were just part of the world that was changing for Maggie, bit by bit. As they walked toward the car, Alice held Maggie gently, her fingers curling softly around her small body. Maggie, still cautious but now trusting, nestled closer to the girl. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. And hope, it seemed, was the beginning of a brand new life. The car ride was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of snowflakes against the window. Maggie, nestled in Alice's lap, kept her eyes on the road ahead, her senses heightened. She could feel the warmth of Alice's hand gently stroking her fur, but her body remained tense, as though every part of her was waiting for something to go wrong. She was used to running, used to the uncertainty of life on the streets, and this quiet, safe ride felt like an unfamiliar dream. As the car pulled into the driveway, Maggie's heart raced. She had no idea what to expect next. The house loomed in front of her, a small, cozy home with warm lights glowing from the windows. But Maggie's experience told her not to trust so easily. She had been let down before. She had been hurt, abandoned. Could she really believe that this time would be different? Deborah opened the door, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "We're home, Maggie." Alice gently lifted the cat out of her lap and set her down on the ground. Maggie froze for a moment, her paws stiff as she stood on the unfamiliar ground. The wind had picked up again, and the chill of the outside world was still in the air. She glanced at Deborah, then Alice, her gaze filled with silent questioning. "Come on, Maggie," Alice coaxed, holding out her hand. "Let's go inside. It's warm." For a moment, Maggie stood still, her body tense with indecision. She wanted to trust them. She wanted to believe that this family would keep her safe, that they would give her the love and warmth she had never known. But something inside her was still afraid. She had spent so long fending for herself, so long surviving in the cold, harsh world, that the idea of fully trusting someone felt like a risk too great to take. Deborah crouched down beside her, her eyes soft and understanding. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," she said, her voice calm. "But we're here, and we want you to feel safe." Maggie's ears flicked back, her fur standing on end. The storm inside her mind was still raging, a storm of fear and distrust. But as she looked into Deborah's eyes, something shifted. There was no threat, no deception in her gaze. Just warmth, just kindness. Slowly, cautiously, Maggie took a few steps forward, her paws trembling slightly as they hit the snow-covered ground. "Good girl," Deborah murmured, her voice low and reassuring. "We'll take it slow, okay?" Maggie's body relaxed a little. She wasn't running away. She wasn't hiding. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Maggie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep running anymore. She could trust them. She could trust this place. Deborah opened the front door, and the warm, welcoming glow from inside spilled out into the night. It was the kind of warmth that made Maggie's fur prickle with comfort, not fear. The scent of home, of food, of fresh linen, of a place where someone cared, filled the air, and for the first time in forever, Maggie felt a pull toward it. As she stepped inside the door, Alice gently lifted her again, cradling her in her arms like a precious treasure. The room was small, but it felt like a haven, a safe place where nothing could hurt her. There was a soft fire crackling in the corner, casting a warm glow across the room. On the couch sat a blanket, soft and inviting, and Maggie instinctively knew that it was her spot now. Alice set Maggie down on the couch, and Deborah knelt beside her. "You're part of this family now, Maggie," she said softly, her voice full of love and assurance. "This is your home." Maggie looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. It was all so different from the cold, barren streets she had known. She looked up at Alice, who was now sitting beside her, her face full of joy and warmth. "We're going to take good care of you," Alice promised, her voice full of excitement. Maggie let out a small meow, as if acknowledging their words, and curled up on the couch. Her muscles, still tense with the anxiety of her past, slowly began to relax. The warmth of the room seeped into her bones, and for the first time in ages, she allowed herself to close her eyes. As Deborah stood and went into the kitchen to prepare something for them to eat, Maggie rested her head on Alice's lap, the little girl's gentle fingers running through her fur. The soft pressure of Alice's touch was soothing, comforting, like a promise that things would be okay, that she was safe. The night passed quietly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside it was warm, peaceful. For Maggie, it felt like the beginning of something new, something better. She had always thought that love and care were things she could only dream of. But now, in this small, quiet home, surrounded by a family that truly cared for her, she was beginning to believe in the possibility of something more. And as she drifted off to sleep, nestled in Alice's arms, Maggie finally let go of the fear that had haunted her for so long. She had found her family, and they had found her. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting golden beams through the frosted window. Inside the small home there was a sense of peace, an unspoken promise that everything had changed. Maggie, now sleeping soundly on the couch, stretched and let out a contented sigh, her body unburdened by the constant tension of her past. The warmth of the home had already worked its magic, easing the deep scars she carried from the harsh world outside. As the soft light filled the room, Alice gently opened her eyes and smiled at the sight of Maggie curled up next to her. The cat was no longer the frightened stray they had brought in just the night before. Now she seemed more at ease, her fur glistening with health and her body relaxed in a way Alice had never seen before. It was as though Maggie had discovered in the stillness of the morning what it meant to feel safe, to be part of something good. Alice shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Maggie, and reached for her book, deciding that today would be a day to stay close to her new friend. She started to read aloud in a soft, gentle voice, as though the rhythm of the words might reassure Maggie even more. The cat's ears flicked, but she didn't move. Her green eyes remained closed, her body still warm against Alice's leg. Once upon a time, Alice began, her voice steady and sweet, there was a little cat who had no home, no family to care for her. But one day, she found the most amazing thing in the world, love, and it changed everything. Deborah, hearing Alice's quiet voice, came into the living room, wiping her hands on a towel from the kitchen. She had prepared breakfast, but the moment was too precious to interrupt. She stood at the doorway, watching her daughter and Maggie, a warm smile on her face. For so long, Deborah had dreamed of creating a home full of love and warmth. But it wasn't just for Alice, it was for everyone. And now, with Maggie in their lives, the dream was becoming reality. After a moment, Deborah stepped into the room. Sitting down on the edge of the couch, she looked down at Maggie, her expression filled with quiet love. "She's a brave little thing," Deborah said softly, running her hand through the cat's fur. "But it's us who are lucky to have her." Maggie opened her eyes slowly, gazing up at Deborah. There was no fear in her gaze, only trust, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She reached up and gently nuzzled Deborah's hand, her purring vibrating in the quiet room. "She's come a long way," Alice whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I can't believe how fast she's changing." Deborah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Sometimes love works in ways we can't understand. She's been through a lot, but I think she's starting to realize she's safe here, that she doesn't have to fight anymore." Maggie shifted slightly, curling closer to Alice's side. It was as though she had made a decision, a quiet acceptance of the life that awaited her here. Her muscles, once tense with fear and distrust, now seemed to relax under the loving touch of the family. She was no longer the stray cat fighting for survival. She was part of a family that cherished her. Alice gently closed her book and leaned back, feeling the soft weight of Maggie's body against hers. She looked at her mom, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I think she loves us, Mom." Deborah's heart melted at the sight. She reached over, brushing a stray lock of hair behind Alice's ear. "She does, sweetheart. She really does." The morning unfolded in peaceful quiet, with the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Deborah prepared a warm breakfast, while Alice and Maggie sat together on the couch. It was a simple moment, but it was one filled with a sense of home. Maggie's journey had been long, and the scars of her past would never fully disappear. But in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of love and family, she was beginning to heal. As the days passed, the bond between Maggie and her new family only deepened. Spring had arrived, and with it, a renewed sense of energy and hope. The world outside was bursting with life. Trees began to bud, flowers bloomed in a riot of colors, and the air smelled of fresh earth and warm sunshine. Inside the house, however, it was the small, quiet moments that brought the greatest joy. One afternoon, Alice and Deborah decided to take Maggie for a walk around the neighborhood. It was a gentle walk, more of a leisurely stroll than an adventure, through a quiet street lined with budding trees and colorful gardens. Maggie, now far from the scared little cat she had been, trotted alongside Alice with a proud tilt of her head. Her tail, once low and anxious, was now held high, swishing gently in the spring breeze. Alice giggled as Maggie sniffed at a patch of flowers, her little paws pressing into the soft grass. It was a joyful sight, one that filled Deborah's heart with warmth. Maggie was not only adjusting to this new life, she was thriving. The cat's eyes sparkled with curiosity and wonder, her newfound confidence shining through in each step she took. "Look, Mom," Alice called out, crouching down to point at a butterfly fluttering by. Maggie's ears perked up as the butterfly danced in the sunlight, and the cat, always the explorer, darted forward to investigate. Her paws light on the ground. Deborah couldn't help but smile as she watched the two of them. Her heart swelled with pride as she saw how far Maggie had come. From the timid, hungry cat who had wandered the streets to this bold, curious creature who now found joy in the simple things. It was nothing short of a miracle, and it was a testament to the power of love, patience, and a home. The trio continued down the path, the soft hum of nature surrounding them. Birds sang overhead, and the breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. The world seemed so alive, and it felt like Maggie had finally found her place in it. It was as though she had always been meant to be here, in this peaceful home, with a family that loved her. As they rounded the corner of their street and approached their house, Alice took Maggie's face in her hands, planting a gentle kiss on her forehead. "You're home now, Maggie. Forever." Maggie blinked up at her with those soulful green eyes, the very picture of contentment. For the first time, she understood the meaning of the word. Home. It wasn't just the place where you lived. It was the place where you were loved, where you felt safe, where your heart could finally heal. Back inside, as the evening sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the room, the family gathered together on the couch. Alice curled up beside Maggie, resting her head on the cat's soft fur. Deborah sat nearby, content and at peace. The house was filled with laughter, the kind of laughter that echoed through the walls and wrapped itself around them like a blanket. It wasn't just a house. It was their home, and Maggie was no longer just a pet. She was part of the family. As the camera zoomed out, the warmth of the room contrasted with the growing twilight outside. Maggie, Alice, and Deborah sat together, a family united by love. The little cat, once lost and alone, had found her forever home. A place where she would always be cared for, cherished, and most of all, loved. And as Maggie lay between Alice and Deborah, her purring filling the air, it was clear. She had finally found everything she had been searching for.